More than 80 years ago, two complex cells united and became a single, unique cell, the beginning of new life. This cell divided and redivided to form trillions of specialized cells that are the cooperative community known as the human body. This body has lived through billions of experiences, each carefully filed in a control center of unbelievable complexity and capacity, the human brain. Each second, this brain receives, analyzes, sorts, and files hundreds of millions of bits of information and issues the millions of orders required to keep the body alive and functioning. This brain, working through this body, will share some of its accumulated wisdom with you today. Welcome, Dr. Paul Brand.
Now, I began last time by telling you that the object of this series is to help you to appreciate yourselves and to know that whether you win races or lose them, whether you pass exams or fail them, you yourselves are wonderful, wonderful people, wonderfully designed, wonderfully made, and that the more you understand yourself, the more you study the mechanisms of life and of thinking, the more excited you ought to get. It's excited me for a long time, and now I want to pass on some of that to you. Well, now, I chose last time the subject of the hand, partly because you took the trouble to bring your own with you, and partly because I love the hand. You know, I work with it, I operate on it, I reconstruct broken hands, and I think that they're wonderful, there's no question. And so I chose a good subject. Now, today I'm going to go on and really have a tough time. It's easy to convince you that your hands are wonderful, but it's pretty hard to convince you that pain is wonderful. In fact, I've heard people say that if there was a God and he designed the human body, he really messed it up when he introduced pain, the one big goof. And if that's the way you feel, I felt pretty much the same way when I started to study medicine. I went to medical school in London, and in my final year, we were being taught about diagnosis and about how to diagnose sicknesses, and so many people come to us with pain. And my particular chief was a real clinical scientist, and he said, I want to try to find a way to quantify pain. He said, people come to you and they say they're having terrible agony, awful pain, but the doctor never knows whether they're building it up, you know, that it's really quite a small pain, and or that maybe the other people really have a bad pain, and they make light of it. They say, well, I can handle it. How do you know what the real pain is, quite apart from what a person says about it? And so he asked for volunteers from the senior class, and we were a big class, about 80 of us, and I was fool enough to volunteer. I didn't quite know what I was in for, but what he did was to tell us at the beginning. He said, I'm going to inflict pain on you. I'm going to make you suffer. And I want you to try to quantify that pain. I want you to tell me, he said, we'll divide it into 10. 1 is a pain that you can hardly feel, and you wouldn't even notice it unless everything were quiet. 10 is a pain that you cannot possibly endure, and I'll try not to bring a number 10 pain in. But when you felt pain, I want you to tell me, is this a number 6 pain, or number 7, or 8 or what is it? And he said, I'm going to use instruments that tell me exactly how much stimulus it is. I'm going to know exactly how many kilograms per square centimeter of pressure I put on you. I'm going to know exactly how many degrees Celsius of temperature. If you're going to have a burn, you know, if you have a little tiny spot burn, I'll know exactly how hot it is. So I can know from outside what the pain is, and you've got to tell me from inside what level it is, okay? And if we can do that, we'll create a kind of a universal pain standard. And we'll ask people, do you have a 5 pain or a 6 pain? And if they don't know what 5 and 6 means, well, then we can give them an example by giving them something like this. This was one of the things that, it wasn't exactly like, it's much more sophisticated than this. We had a vice like this that would squeeze us, but the little vice had sensors. It had little transducers that said exactly how much pressure the person was receiving. So we'd put our finger in here, and he'd go like that. And then there was a screw back here. Yeah, now it's about 2. That's a 2 pain. And then he'd, now that's 5. Wait a minute. And he'd do this to us. I mean, I had this when I was not much older than you are. And, ouch. Oh, boy. Now, that's a 7. There we are. We're getting up there. And we'd... I wonder if I can go any higher. Okay, that's 8. Let's take it. You can see, boy. Now, volunteers. I believe I could get it up to 9. Would you like to try a 9 pain? Well, you know, we didn't like it either. We had some fun over it. And another thing he'd do is put a blood pressure cuff on our upper arm and cut off the blood supply. Just, you know, that's like taking your blood pressure. There's nothing in that. And then he'd say, now do this. And we exercised our hand without any blood supply. And if you do that, now this you could do at home. It's kind of fun. If you exercise without blood supply, without oxygen, the metabolism of the muscle cannot be complete. And you're really using backup stores. And the material in there turns into lactic acid. The acetylcholine builds up and doesn't get washed away with blood. And soon your muscle goes into a cramp. Have you ever had a cramp in your calf after you've been running or something? Well, you'd go into a terrible cramp. And then he'd say, go on, do some more, do some more. And so we had to quantify cramping muscle pains. And so we tried a lot of things. And we tried to work out. But you know what we found? And it's very interesting. We found that it really is almost impossible to quantify what you feel in your mind in relation to the impulse that causes it. Because pain doesn't happen where the injury is. You know, if you hit your thumb with a hammer by mistake when you're trying to drive in a nail, it feels as if your thumb is hurting. But in fact, a thumb is injured, but there's no pain there. The pain is in a nerve that runs up the arm. And so we needed a lot more study before we got much further, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. So by the time I finished medicine, I was against pain. You know, I'd experienced quite a little bit of it, and I thought, well, I'm going to be a doctor. If there's one thing I want to be able to accomplish in my life, it is to relieve people who are suffering pain. And that's one reason why I went to India as a missionary doctor and taught orthopedic surgery in India, because I knew that in India at that time, this is nearly 50 years ago, people in India didn't have much pain medication. And they didn't have much treatment for severe diseases and injuries, and I wanted to be able to get rid of their pain for them. Well, it's a long time ago. And now I've written this book, which says pain the gift that nobody wants. Because I've turned right around. I have realized what a wonderful thing pain is. And I want to tell you kind of why I have realized that. And I think it was because of a lot of patients that I have met. And one of them was a little girl called Tanya. She was actually South American, Latin American by descent, but they lived in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And her mother brought little Tanya, 4 years old, to see me because she had heard that I treated people who didn't seem to have any pain. And little Tanya was a sweet, pretty girl, and all her fingers had adhesive plaster on them, and they all seemed to be a little bit short. But the thing that was the problem was her foot. The mother told her she had deep, deep ulcers in her foot, and that the ankle had become dislocated. 4 years old. And so I sat her up on a table, and I took the bandages off and took a probe and began to feel. And I looked at her face because, it's kind of pretty painful to take a steel probe to explore an open wound. But she didn't seem to care. She was just looking around the room. And so I felt around the bones. There were some bones exposed. And then I said to the mother, what's all these bandages on her fingers? And she said, well, let me tell you the story. She said, we thought Tanya was a normal baby. She was just a sweet, pretty girl, and we loved her. And she cut her teeth, and when she was 2 years old, she had a good row of her front teeth. And she said she was a well-behaved baby, and I would sometimes leave her in the playpen while I went and cooked in the kitchen. And one day I heard her laughing in her playpen. And she said, I went in to see what she was laughing at, and I saw that she was finger painting. She had a white sheet, and she was making red circles on the white sheet with her fingertip. I thought, well, where's she got these paints from? And then she smiled, and I saw some blood on her lips. And I looked at the finger and screamed. She said, I saw that Tanya had bitten off the end of her finger with her new little teeth and was finding the blood such fun that she was painting circles. And she said, from that moment onwards, it's been all downhill. Because she likes doing this. It's fun for her. And we try to stop her, and we get angry with her. But whatever we tell her to do or not to do, even at meal times, if we say you've got to finish your spinach or eat the things that you're leaving behind, all she has to do is to put a finger like this and show her teeth, and at once we let her do whatever she likes. Because she's the boss. She has discovered that we get worried about her biting her fingers. It doesn't bother her. And so we have no control over her. And we once, we put dressings on her feet, we put a plaster cast on her foot, and she just tore it off, and her fingers were bleeding, but it didn't bother her. And she just does whatever she likes. Well, we put her in another plaster cast that she perhaps couldn't take off for her foot. But I told the mother that I knew what the problem was. This is a genetic defect. One of her genes, somehow, we don't know why, maybe some form of radiation, but one of her genes had gone wrong. And it's a condition that we call Denny-Brown syndrome, or sometimes we call it congenital indifference to pain. And these children never feel pain. At least they feel it. They know that they're being touched. They know what's happening. But it doesn't bother them. It doesn't hurt. They don't dislike it. And very few such children ever live through their teenage years. I once had an opportunity to examine an autopsy in Montreal at McGill. There was a great McNaughton. Dr. McNaughton was a wonderful scientist there, and he knew I was interested in pain, and so he showed me these. This young woman had already lost the front part of both feet and all her fingers, but she was still able to drive a car. She'd never felt pain. And the car went off the road into a ditch, And she tried to lift the front wheels, lift the front of the car, and lift it back on where she could get some traction. And she heard her back break while she was doing this. Didn't hurt her. But anyhow, she heard a crack in her back. And afterwards, she found that she kind of wobbled when she walked. And then she found that she couldn't pass urine properly because the nerves, she had broken her back, and the nerves to the bladder and things had been cut. And she eventually died of urinary infection. But isn't that sad? Anyway, I went to India, and in India I met a disease called leprosy. Some of you heard of leprosy? Very common in Asia. And I was very distressed because I was trying to operate on people who were deformed. And these people with leprosy had terrible deformities. And I wanted to correct the deformities, you know, do operations. But everybody said to me, oh, it's no use operating on leprosy patients. Their wounds don't heal. They've got non-healing flesh. And besides, they say they can't feel pain. And they said another thing about leprosy is the disease makes the fingers go rotten. So fingers fall off. Have any of you heard about leprosy? Do you know, have you heard that this happens, that fingers become rotten in leprosy? And they were thinking that the disease, the germs, made the flesh kind of rotten, and that therefore it would fall away. And I said to them, I said, you know, it seems strange to me, these people can't feel pain, and they have this disease, leprosy. The disease destroys pain sensation for the leprosy patients. Why do we have to assume that the disease makes the fingers rotten? Couldn't it be that the fingers fall off simply because the patients can't feel pain? Perhaps they're all the time injuring themselves. And the doctor said, well, you know, we know they can't feel pain, and we know that they do injure themselves. But so many of them have all their fingers equally kind of shrunken away. So it can't all be due to injuries. And let's have a look at a couple of slides. That's the kind of person we used to have. And you see this man has really just stumpy fingers and hardly any thumbs. And he had been working in a construction company, and he used to carry bricks. And now, because he hadn't got fingers, he couldn't get his fingers around the bricks. He just held a pile of bricks together with his wrists. And now you see he was getting wounds on his wrists as well. And here we see this guy was working as a carpenter. And when I saw him, he was just working away. And the bone, can you see that bone there? That is the end bone of his finger sticking out through the thing. And it didn't bother him a scrap. Didn't bother him. And this little lad called Thangalingam, he came to me to have his fingers straightened out because he had paralysis from leprosy. And you can see the fingers kind of curled up. And we knew how to do this, and his joints were still nice and mobile. So we said, okay, you must have some physiotherapy to get your fingers loose, and then we'll operate on you and get them straightened out. And so he said, okay, and he went home that night. And the next day, you can't see this terribly clearly, but the next day he came back with the back of his finger missing. The finger that only yesterday had been a beautiful finger, but that was bent, now it didn't have flesh on the back of the finger. And we looked at the edges of it, and we saw little tooth marks all the way around. And we knew that leprosy patients, sometimes a rat will come, and it'll nudge the finger while the patient's asleep. And anybody else would immediately move their hand, and the rat would run away. But with these patients, the patient doesn't feel anything, and so the rat goes on and begins to eat the finger. And this is how it is that leprosy patients lose their fingers, only because they can't feel pain. Well, we soon found out how to take care of this problem. We began breeding cats. I had a lovely Siamese cat at home, a male, who was very fond of female cats. And so we got a whole bunch of females, and we had a breeding program. And every leprosy patient who came to us for surgery and for other things, we sent him home with a kitten and told them you must always sleep with a kitten beside you. And once we started doing that, the rats had no more opportunity, and this particular problem has really stopped. One patient I had, a boy called Raman, about 15. He had learned everything. He learned to use cats. He'd learned to be careful with his fingers. And then he said, well, I know everything now. I'm going to go home for a weekend. And he went home, and that night, because he'd forgotten to take a cat home with him, that night he lost the back of one of his fingers. He got so angry in the morning. Of course, it didn't hurt him, but he got so angry that he'd neglected to take a cat home. He said, I'm going to get that rat. And the next night, he sat up all night long with a stick in his hand. To stay awake, he was reading a book. He was leaning, people sleep on mats in India, and he was squatting on this mat, leaning against the wall, with a stick in his right hand and a book on his knees. About 4 o'clock in the morning, he got more and more sleepy and just couldn't keep his eyes open, and the stick fell down, and the book fell on his knees, and his hand fell away onto the hurricane lantern that he'd been using for reading. Now, hurricane lantern is a paraffin lantern with a hot globe, and the back of his hand rested on the hot globe until he woke up in the morning with the daylight. And he came to me the next day, and he was crying. He had bandages on both hands. He said, rat and a burn. He said, I feel as if I'm in prison. I shall never be free because I can't feel pain. And you know, I cried with him. We cried together because I couldn't restore pain. I could skin graft his hand, and we could see about the cat. But pain is the thing that keeps us whole. Pain is so important. If pain is so essential, so wonderful, why does everybody hate it? Why don't we all say, well, pain is wonderful? Well, you know, I've wondered about that myself. And I think the chief reason is because it hurts, doesn't it? And we don't like something that hurts, even if perhaps theoretically we think it's kind of important. And we wish that somehow the person or the thing or the system that designed the human body had found a way to inform us when we were in danger, to inform us when a rat was starting to bite, to inform us when we were too close to the fire, and yet it needn't hurt. Or if it didn't do that, even if it had to hurt, couldn't we have a switch that we could switch it off when we had listened to it and knew what the problem was? Why should it have to go on hurting? And another reason why people don't like pain is because there is a $60 billion industry in America, $60 billion and more, of people who want to sell pain-relieving medications. You know, Tylenol, aspirin, Advil, heroin, whatever you like, all the whole sequence. They want to sell these things. And in order to sell them, they advertise. And every time, at least where I am, every time you turn on the television, you see advertisements. You don't need to suffer pain. If you've got a pain in your stomach, plop, plop, fizz, fizz, and you take Alka-Seltzer, and the pain goes away, and you can go on abusing your stomach. Because pain in your stomach, if you listen to it, is probably telling you that you've eaten too much, or that you ate too fast, or that you ate the wrong things. And if you listen to your stomach, then next time you'll eat more sensibly. But if you don't, if you just suppress the pain, when you get to be 50 or 60 years old, you're going to have chronic indigestion. And that's a bad thing. So these are the kind of reasons why people don't like pain. And also I've given you a couple of reasons why you should appreciate it. You know, a single-celled animal, you've done some biology, I'm sure, a single-celled animal like an amoeba, where there's only one cell, if you put something unpleasant into the water beside an amoeba, like acid, it'll kind of shrink up and move away. it must in some way feel danger from pain. It has a sense of pain. But when you get multi-celled animals, well, let's go up stage by stage. You go up to an animal like a volvox, which is simply a bunch of very similar unspecialized cells. And how does if you hurt a volvox on one side of it, how does the other side know that it's being hurt? Isn't it only the cells that are actually being damaged that feel the pain? Well, it's interesting. We don't know too much about it exactly, but you see, if I went over there and I hit you with a hammer and hurt you, well, then the guy next to you would probably know that you'd been hurt. And so he'd tell this guy that so-and-so has been hurt, and he'd tell him, and then the back row would get into the act, and gradually across the whole classroom would come the information that I'd broken this guy's head. That's like pain without a nervous system, and it's a wave of pain, rather like the wave that you get sometimes in a football field when all the spectators are trying to send a message. But when you get to a real big animal, like an amphioxus or a fish or an animal, if there were no pain, there'd be a tendency for the head, when there's a famine, when there's no food around, the head might feel hungry, and it'd turn around and it would see a tail and might eat it. Because there's no way that the head would know that the tail is being damaged. And this is what really happens. I've worked with rats, and I've made one foot insensitive because we've been trying to treat leprosy patients, and I wanted to know how to protect feet that were insensitive. And what we realize is that there's a cell, a special little cell. Most cells, you know, are round or square, or perhaps twice as long or 3 times as long as a round cell, as they are wide. But this particular cell is most extraordinary in that it extends itself. Just think about what it takes in your body when you were an embryo. For this little cell here, which we call a neuron, the end of it goes on and on, and on and on and on, and on and on, and on and on and on, and on and on. And finally, here is a thumb and some fingers, and it brings sensation from the tip of the thumb all the way up here to where the brain is, or to where the spinal cord is. And that neuron is an exceptional cell, quite amazing, that it should become hundreds and thousands of times longer than it is wide. And yet it isn't a wire, it's a real living cell with cellular cytoplasm along this little tube. Now I'm going to talk about that another day. But I want you to realize what a remarkable thing it is. And all the cells, all the little nerves from each finger, from each toe, and wherever they are, they join together in bundles, and they go up till they finally get to the level where they are. And the message that they send is not painful. I mean, there's no pain in the nerve. There's damage at the end, where the nerve ending is, and then there's simply an electrical kind of a bleep, like beep, 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 beep. That doesn't hurt. It's just a message. It's an objective piece of information. And it runs up the nerve, and finally, when it gets up to the brain, which has the whole thing mapped out so beautifully, the brain says, that's coming from my thumb, my right thumb. There must be some damage there. And it pulls it away from wherever it was. It's like a telephone. You know, sometimes our telephone at home rings, and my wife will get up to answer the phone, and I watch her face. And sometimes it looks kind of glum, and I know that somebody's trying to sell something. But sometimes it'll brighten up, and she'll say, oh, it's Mary. And then suddenly her face will fall. Oh, really? Oh, dear, And you know, she is feeling pain. Because Mary, her daughter, my daughter, has told her that our granddaughter has fallen down and cut her cheek or something. And so my wife is feeling sorrow and suffering because a little girl away in Virginia has fallen down and the only message is an electric message along the telephone wire. And that basically is how pain works. Pain is not pain until you know about it in your head. When you receive the message from your thumb, then you create suffering, you create a situation that compels you, because it really hurts, it compels you to find a way out of it. It's an amazing thing. And sometimes, if you're very busy, if you're doing a lot of things at the same time, you don't feel the pain so intensely. You know, we, in medicine, if a person has a bad pain in their hand somewhere, and we can't cure the condition, and so they have to go on feeling pain, sometimes we'll do what I call the hairbrush treatment. I think I invented this in India, but nowadays they do it electrically. Instead of just dealing only with where the pain comes from, where the injury is, we get a hairbrush. And a hairbrush has got thousands and thousands of little bristles. And we just do this with a stiff hairbrush. Can you imagine what that does? Anybody smart here? Every bristle, yeah? Every bristle, as it goes across my skin, is stimulating thousands and thousands and thousands of nerve endings. It isn't causing real damage, although I think with a real stiff bristle you could, but it's like scratching, you know? And it is sending so many messages from so many bristles, stimulating so many nerves, that there's a thing called a gate. There's a narrow piece of spinal cord just below your brain, and that gate gets overcrowded with messages. So there really isn't room for many pain messages to get through. You still know that your hand is hurting, but the hurt of your hand is substantially diminished because all the circuits are busy. And now there's a hint. When you have a chronic pain for some reason, don't sit and think about it. I always quarrel with people who design hospitals. I think they're designed to sell pain medication. I think they're designed by people who make aspirin and Tylenol. Don't sit and think about it. Do something. If you're busy, if you're writing to somebody, talking to somebody, going for a walk, doing some bird watching, whatever you're doing, you find that the pain gets less. It isn't that the stimulus gets less. It is that there are so many things to think about that the pain gets crowded out. Now, I'd like to tell you what I did myself to try to substitute for pain. When I came to work for the U.S. Public Health Service, they gave me some funds. I told you last time that we worked with computers, but mostly at that time, we had a lot of patients suffering from leprosy, and some with diabetes who couldn't feel with their feet, and some with congenital indifference to pain. And I got some engineers, hired them, and said, now look, here's our project. I'm going to try to find a way to inform the brain of these patients when their foot or their hand or any other part is getting into trouble, so that they can take avoiding action and save themselves from injury. And the engineers thought, well, that's a good idea. So I said, it's going to be like a pain system, only it won't hurt. And one of the engineers said, oh, that's good, we can do that. We'll do it electrically, and we're going to patent it. And when we've really got it working well, I expect that people will come to us, even normal people, and they'll have their pain system cut out, and they'll have our system, the electrical system, put in place, because ours doesn't hurt. Well, they did a very good job. They made tiny little miniature electric transducers that could sense pressure. And we would test it with a thing like this. We'd put these little transducers on the finger, tiny little ones, and then we'd put known pressures on them. And the engineers had arranged little tiny fine wires that went up here into a hearing aid. And so every time we squeezed the finger too hard, or they squeezed it too hard, they'd hear a beep in their ear, like the ending of a nerve. And if they went too close to something hot, if they were cooking and they didn't know that they were using a hot pan, they would get a heat beep, and that would register with a different note in the hearing aid. This was very, very clever, very expensive. Every transducer cost us, I think it was about $140, something of that sort, I forget. But the whole complete system was extremely expensive. But it worked. And the people who had them, they thought, well, this is wonderful. And they would go to the carpenter's bench and they'd pick up a tool and they'd hold it, and there's no beep. Then they'd squeeze the hand a bit and it would start beeping in their ear. And they knew then that beeping only came on when they were holding something too tightly. There were problems because, well, I can't go into details, but the threshold, the thing that stimulates a real nerve in a real person, is much more complex. Sometimes a very small pressure will cause harm if it's continuously kept there without any relaxation. And that means that a little piece of skin will be deprived of blood supply. And these transducers wouldn't detect that, but a normal human being would. And so we were rather excited. We thought we'd done very well. And then we found that the people who were fitted up with this expensive hearing aid and all these little things on their hands and feet, we found that they weren't taking any notice of them. When we asked them, why don't you take your hand away when it starts beeping, they said, well, we're kind of bored with this now. It isn't a game anymore. And if you want to do something, well, then you go ahead and do it. We used to say that they are task-oriented. That means that they want to do something, they'll do it. Now, you and I are all body-oriented. And if we start doing something and it hurts, then we quit. But if they're doing something and it beeps, and they want to do it, they go on doing it. They simply would tune out the beeps. And we increased the volume so that sometimes I would be standing next to a man on the carpenter's bench, and I could hear his beeping. But he just went on doing what he was doing. He didn't listen. So the engineers came to me and they said, if we're going to succeed in forming a substitute for pain, it's got to hurt. Okay? It's got to hurt. It isn't enough to give the information. We don't avoid injury to ourselves, protected by pain, because we're intelligent. We avoid injury because pain hurts. And we know that if we're doing something that gives us pain, it's a warning to quit. Okay? So I said to the engineers, okay, make it hurt. Now, they couldn't make it hurt on the children who had congenital indifference to pain, but they could make it hurt on the leprosy patients, who are our prime object. Because leprosy doesn't take pain away from the whole body. It only takes pain away from the parts of the body that are relatively cool. I won't go into why that is, but it's interesting. So the hands are much cooler than the shoulders, and the feet are much cooler than your hips. And some places like the armpit is always warm. It's warm and moist in the armpit. And so the engineers developed a little shocking coil, you know, like a little solenoid. This little coil was about the size of a thumb, and they hooked it up to the beeper in the ear, and they tucked it into the axilla, into the armpit. And now the people who were wired up for their pain system, now they would go doing something, and if they did it too strongly or if they were in danger, they'd first of all hear the beep, and if they didn't obey the beep and get away from the danger, then they'd get a shock. And it was a real stinging little shock. Not dangerous, but you know, the axilla is kind of moist, and that reduces the resistance of the skin to electric shocks, and they'd get a little shock. And this really made an effect. They began to respond to this. We didn't try it for very long. I was standing, again, close to somebody in the manual arts department, and he was trying to repair his motorcycle engine. And it had been outdoors a lot, and he was trying to take the cylinder head off the cylinder at the gasket, and the bolts and nuts were rusty. And he had a wrench, and he was pulling on this wrench, trying to get this thing loosened up. And I saw him, as he was doing this, give a little kind of jerk like that. And then he put the wrench down, reached underneath the arm, switched off his machine, and then got a bigger wrench and really put all his force behind it and got that nut off the bolt. And I walked away from that manual arts department knowing that I had failed. Just knowing that I had failed. I'd made it hurt, but there was a switch somewhere. And I began to know that if there is an available switch, people will switch it off. And therefore, it was no real protection to these people. It was a real distress for me. Shortly after that, I went to Chicago in the winter, where it was a very cold winter, and I had a friend up there called Dr. Boswick, and he was a specialist in burns and frostbite. And he took me to a ward where there were 37 patients, all suffering frostbite. Their toes were all black, and sometimes some of them had half their foot black with frostbite. And it was a terribly cold winter. And I said to John Boswick, I said, look, this is a disgrace to Chicago. How come that you allow all these people to be sleeping outdoors? Aren't there shelters that the city could provide on cold nights to allow these people not to get frostbite? He said, these aren't destitute people. These people have mostly got homes of their own. But every one of them is an alcoholic or a drug addict. And they have escaped from pain. They don't like themselves. They in some way feel that they're losers. They perhaps feel that they're some way failures. And they've taken to alcohol or drugs to take them into a world, a kind of dreamland world, where everything is beautiful. They don't feel pain, they don't feel anything bad. And he said, if you ask all these men here their history of the frostbite, they would all say something very similar. They'd probably tell you that they're alcoholic or drug addicts, and they'd say that they went to a party, had a good party, had a lot to drink, became a bit drunk, were afraid of driving home, afraid they wouldn't be able to control their car. And so they got a friend who wasn't drunk to drive them home. And the friend drove them home and put them off at their own front doorstep and then drove away. And these guys put their hand in their pocket to find their keys, their latch keys, and they probably found it, and they went to the... and they couldn't put the key into the hole. They were disoriented. And then they said to themselves, what the heck? It's all right here. And they'd lie down on their own front doorstep and go to sleep. Some of them, he said, would even rest their head on the snow because it was kind of nice and soft, and they'd put their coat down. And in the morning, the milkman or the boy who delivered the paper would come and find them. And by that time, their feet had become frozen. And so I said, didn't they even feel pain then? He said, no, they were quite happy. I shall never forget that sentence. They're quite happy. They've escaped. And there they were with gangrenous feet, waiting for the surgeon to see how well demarcated the gangrene was, and then they were going to come and chop the foot off. Not because they had leprosy, not because they'd been born unable to feel pain, but because they had chosen to switch it off. I don't suppose you know the name Joan Benoit, but she was a wonderful athlete. She was the first to win the women's marathon in Boston. And the press gathered round her and said, wasn't it a terrible strain for you as a woman to run all those miles up hills and down dales? She said, no, I enjoyed myself. She said, my body was talking to me all the time. We were having a conversation, and I was listening to it. And I knew just how far I could take my muscles, because when they were too much on the stretch and I was running too fast, they'd speak to me in the language of pain. And so I relaxed a little bit. And then they'd say, okay, you can go a little faster. And she said, it's a wonderful feeling to be in control, to be a master of your body. And I would recommend this to you. Make pain your friend. You know, there's a terrible tendency in America to soften ourselves. You know, to air condition everything we're in. We never experience cold or heat or roughness. And we sit in the armchair and we watch television and we watch somebody else exercising and somebody else doing this and somebody else doing that. And we're soft and we're afraid of pain. Americans are afraid of pain, more afraid than people in India who don't have access to pain medication. You know, the pain is not the opposite of pleasure. Pleasure and pain are very similar to each other. And I find that people who don't allow themselves to be afraid of pain, people who involve themselves in adventure, who climb mountains and camp out and swim and do things, take risks. These are the people who get to enjoy their bodies. And I like to have a hot bath sometimes, not very often. I like to shower most of the time, but if I've been kind of exhausted at the end of a day, I'll fill the bath with water, and it's got to be hot. I mean, not just warm. And then I take my clothes off and I put my feet on the edge of the bath over here and my hands behind here, and I suspend myself over that hot water. And I'm never quite sure whether it's too hot and it's going to hurt me, or whether it's just hot enough and it's going to be pleasure. And so I lower myself, my backside, and my buttocks will touch the water, and then I know. And I think, is this pain or is it pleasure? They're so close. And then I lower myself slowly, and the water tingles as it burns. And it's a wonderful, wonderful sensation. And if I were to let go with my hand, or it slipped and I would fall right in, that would be pain. If the water were cool enough so that it never felt like pain, that wouldn't be pleasure. And I believe that pain and pleasure, they're like two sides of a peak. If you want to read more about this, read the Chinese philosopher Lin Yuteng. You'll get some more details about the nature of real pleasure. The nature of real pleasure is involvement. And enjoy your body. Enjoy the sight and the sound and the hearing and the muscles and the joints and the pain. And you'll find that by using the pain, it sets you free. It's not like the poor leprosy patient who said, I'm in prison because I can't feel pain. So it's a gift. It's a gift. Enjoy it.